Can. Okay. All right. So today we'll do the third part of the introduction to Arabic NLP. And so last time we didn't cover as much slides as I hoped to, and so this time we'll still have to continue with syntax and cover the rest of it. Please ask questions. I think at one point, if we're beyond the 1 hour, if I might run by like 15 minutes. If you feel you have to leave, just leave. It's okay. Okay. So last time we stopped at this. We discussed morphology. We started talking about syntax and talked about the interaction between morphology and syntax. And today we're just going to jump more into syntax. So in Arabic, this description actually of Arabic grammar is what's used in the Arabic tree bank, and it's also has a lot. Traditional Arabic grammar thinks of constructing the Arabic sentence in standard Arabic in the same way. So this is kind of, and you'll see in some cases it might look a bit different than what you're used to in the English tree bank, but it does explain all the different phenomena that appear in Arabic. So typically people talk about two types of Arabic sentences, verbal sentences and copular sentences. In the verb sentence, there's only one basic order, which is the verb subject object order. So verb appears initially, and then you have your subject and your object. And then there's copular sentences, which have a topic and a complement, or a predicate, basically, that comes after. And most simple example is just a simple copula of the boys are poets, boys poet. But they can be quite complex structures that could follow in the complement. And you'll see, as I'll describe later, that the form of SVO, which has quite a high distribution in the MSA corpus, and more actually in the dialect corpus, is basically constructed by combining the two forms of sentences. So the SVO is considered a topic followed by a VSO complement. So I'll give more details on this as we go along. Now, in the verbal sentences, you have a verb agreement. So this is the verb that comes first, agrees only with the gender of the noun. So this is kind of what makes it a bit interesting here. And this is one of the main phenomena that this split between the different orders is trying to explain. So for the example that I use, you have the verb write with boys or with girls. It's the same form for the verb. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't change whether the number of the boys or the girls is different. But it does change across gender. So you get the T ending, and you'll see it marked in red, which basically shows the agreement with the gender only.
So the fact that it's singular there is not significant.
Sorry?
So you're saying the fact that it's singular is not significant?
Right, the fact that it's singular is not significant. Yes, I should explain this. The agreement shows three masculine singulars. Singular is the default in this case. Right, so there's no special kind of agreement that is a non-gender agreement. A special kind of agreement that is a non-number agreement, right? So it always defaults to the singular form, regardless of the number of the subject.
Then how do you know it's the singular form?
Well, because it's the same form that appears in the singular when you have, when you're not specifying. So you could actually also say, like she wrote, and then in that case you don't need to specify the pronoun she. So there's also pro-drop involved, and I covered. Yeah, so the pro-drop was covered in the earlier slide about the interaction with morphology, and shows here with the case of pronominal subjects are always written so they're just conjugated, and you can treat them. Again, these are the kind of choices. You can decide to split them and treat them as separate entities, or keep them attached and just consider it a pro-drop situation. Passive verbs have exactly the same structure too. So this is kind of if you know how passives works in other languages, just with the change of the word order, it should work the same here. So you have the verb in the passive form, and then you have the subject following it, which is the underlying object. So one of the so because of this singular defaulting that happens in the VSO order, you could actually get this ambiguity of that when you have a verb third masculine singular followed by some noun, and you don't know case, because in the orthography you might not see the case most of the time here. So one possibility here structurally is that the subject is he, and it's just pro-dropped, it's conjugated with the verb, or that the subject is actually the noun that follows, and the agreement is in the third masculine singular, right? Other things that happen here, kind of interestingly, the passive and the active form are most of the time look exactly the same because they're mostly a vocalism change, which means that you're not going to see it because of the orthography. So that also affects the interpretation of the structure. Now, do you have any questions so far about this? Okay. So the copular sentences have the form of a topic followed by a complement. Most commonly, the topic is definite and the complement is indefinite. So, and I'll come back to definiteness. I mentioned earlier in a previous slide, actually from last lecture, about the importance of definiteness and how it interacts with structure. And I'll have more slides on this. But this is the first instance that we see this. So you could also have an auxiliary to mark other features, like tense, for example. The default tense in the copular structure is that it's a present tense. So it's the boy is X. So to mark other tenses or even other forms, there's other subtle additions to the semantics. So there's a set of auxiliaries that are used and kind of usually referred to as Kana and her sisters because they're referring to the most common form of them, which is the verb can, which means to be. And here in the past, when you say the boy was a poet, you have to have that auxiliary appear. And it appears in a very similar form, like very similar to the verb subject object order. So it has the VSO order. And another one that I'll come back to talk to later is Laysa, which is the second one, which is basically a not be. So these auxiliaries are not just indicating tense, they're indicating sometimes negation, other features. In some cases, you might find the inverted order present. And there are lots of reasons that people have studied for like when does that happen, where the topic and the complement appear in the opposite order. One of the most common one is that if you have an indefinite topic, it's disallowed to be the first word in the sentence, it moves next. So here is the at me book or I have a book. This is how you'd say I have a book in Arabic. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that the complement can be quite an interesting structure because it can take a lot of different substitutions in it. So some of the basic complements are, that you could have a noun or an adjective. So the boy is smart, the boy, John, meaning the boy is smart, the boy is John. You could have a prepositional phrase following, so this is the boy is in the library. And again, to have any of the auxiliaries, you just put it at the beginning. So the boy was in the library becomes, was boy in the library. You could have another copular sentence, and this is where the meaning of the topic becomes more like a topic that we're used to when we talk about in English. So the boy, his book is big, is considered basically another form of this copular sentence. That's a copular structure embedded, and where the complement is just another copular structure. And then, of course, the complement can be also another complete verbal sentence. So in this case, you have the boys, and then you have wrote they, or they wrote poems, right? And in this case, you'll see that the agreement of the underlying verb here is with the topic, right? It's basically the verb has its subject. It's the third. It's the plural subject in this case. And so it fully agrees with the topic that it's referring to. Right, and so this is, if this was, I should have had more details on this example here. I think we'll come back to it later too, still.
So you're still calling this a copular sentence?
This would be a copular, yes, because what happens, if you look at the inside, this part here, right. It has a different form of, it has the same order of the verb, subject, object, right, internally. If this was just the verb, subject, object, so you would say write, boys, blah, 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 the verb should not show the agreement in number. It should only show the agreement in gender. But in this position, it shows agreement in both number and gender. So it's inflected differently. And to try to explain why this morphological inflection is happening, you have to describe it this way.
You're using the plural form of wrote.
Yes, you're using the plural form of wrote in this case.
In the other case, you would have used
you the singular. That's correct.
Boys' poems.
That's right. That's right.
And what's the difference in meaning?
In this case, it's the same.
But the,
I can't detect that
so
difference.
the focus is on boys because it can move forward. Anyway.
I mean, I'm not really sure if I can necessarily even say that. I mean, there might be some situations where you could say it's better to say it this way because you want to bring more attention to the topic, but I'm not sure that's actually necessary. I mean, there's...
In other words, if somebody asked, did the girls write the poem, then I would say, no, the boys are the ones who wrote the poem.
For example, that's a possibility, yeah. And there is another form where this kind of gets even more interesting, where the topic could actually be, is not the subject of the verbal complement, but really the object of the verbal complement. So in this case, you have poems, and then you have wrote it, and the it is the object, basically, that is referring back to poems, or wrote them, I should say. And then the boys come after that.
This is really topicalization.
Was it yes, you can say that. But you have this agreement pattern here that is quite important to explain. Because you can still also move them sometimes without doing the agreement. In that case, it looks more like topicalization.
Okay.
So there's lots of phenomena that they're trying to explain together using the same simple CFG, I suppose, in this case, right?
And here wrote is singular.
Here, wrote is singular, that's right. Because within the verbal structure, the verb comes before the subject. The subject is the plural boys, but it doesn't really matter because in that order, it doesn't make a difference, right? And technically also have to say another thing. I mean, part of the evidence of when you look at these cases, which I'm not discussing here because most of the time case is just, you're not going to get it as your input, so it doesn't matter. The case actually patterns shift too. So when you have something like this, in the poems, the children wrote them, poems is nominative. But if you did just moving the poem from the inside structure, like if it was, wrote the boys the poems, and you move the poems up, which you can do. I mean, we see that in poetry sometimes. In that case, poems is actually accusative. So it carries the case of the internal state it's in, but here it's acting syntactically in a very different way. So you can argue that underlying, it's basically the same meaning, there's the same thematic roles involved, but the realization creates different syntactic structures that cause different cases to be realized.
So don't go away from this yet. So
Okay.
I don't understand what principle was used to say that in the first case, wrote has to have a plural
Right. So.
marker on it. In the second case, singular was acceptable.
Right. So in the first case, the subject is the boys,
Okay.
right? But it's not outside,
Okay.
right? So if you basically have the boys and then you have write the poems, the verb has to show the agreement, or at least realize the subject, right? So it's either that the subject is fully realized, and in that case you don't care about the number, or if it's not realized, you have to have a pronoun that stands for the subject, and that pronoun inflects fully, like we'll show that it refers fully in gender and number to the actual subject that was, you're going to say, moved or appears as a topic in this case.
So in other words, if the boy was the one who had written the poems, then even in the first case it would be wrote he.
And if it was, so in that case, so in that case, if you say al-walad katab al-ash'ar, right, or katab al-walad al-ash'ar, they would look exactly the same. There would be like no evidence there for anything that's going on because the default agreement looks like he in this case. That's right. Yeah. So if you look just at the third masculine singular, you actually see no evidence to tell you anything is funny going on. Yeah. Just kind of like keep getting closer to it. Okay, so talk about the noun phrase structure. Simple structure, you have the determiner followed, your noun, adjective, post modifiers, adjectives come after. So this is one of the interesting transformations you'll have to do going to a different language where adjectives precede. So I just, put an example of a kind of slightly long NP. So this, the writer, the ambitious, and then you could have these kind of participles, arriving or coming from Japan. Now, Noun and adjectives do agree, so you have agreement in terms of number and gender, and also definiteness. So female writer who's ambitious, you have to say the feminine writer, the feminine ambitious. Feminine plural writers, feminine plural ambitious. And another interesting construction is this idafa construction. So this is another one of those interesting good words to know when you talk about Arabic. So the idafa construction is basically a way to indicate the relationship of something, or something's something. But it's encoded structurally, meaning you don't actually have a realized lexical item that says, here's the relationship between the two. So one of the ways of encoding it structurally is that the first noun is indefinite and the second noun is definite. So in this case, King the Jordan is the king of Jordan, or Jordan's king. Now this, in terms of, again, the subtle features of the realization of case, like remember we talked a long time ago, well, 3 weeks ago, about nunation, which was the marker of indefiniteness on the nouns. So this is basically the evidence that we see here that when I say that noun 1 become definite, I mean that it cannot be nunated anymore. It shows the regular case as if it was a definite word, even though it doesn't have a definite article. There's no other evidence to make it definite in terms of the markings that it show, except that it's in this construction. And also syntactically, in that case, it will agree with a definite adjective, right? So to say King the Jordan and then describe him as tall, you have to use the tall in this case, referring to the king.
Because the got taken over by Jordan.
Basically.
Everything else has to.
Right, so it's basically king, even though morphologically it's not, but just by looking at the pieces in it, it doesn't look definite. It is definite by this association, which
Otherwise
makes...
it would be a modifier of Jordan.
Otherwise it would be... Yeah, so you could have this ambiguity, of course, too, that you could have, the first noun is the first part of an idafa construction where you have a complete NP with a noun and an adjective under it. So there's that possible ambiguity there, too. So this makes that ambiguity even harder, right, because of the agreement. You could also have idafa chains, where you could have multiple nouns. So this is the basic principle, is that you can have a noun that is indefinite followed by a definite noun, and that makes it definite, which means that you can plug another indefinite noun at the beginning. So this is kind of a funny example, a bit pushing it. It doesn't really, they don't get this long. But so it's like the son of the uncle of the neighbor of the chief of the committee of the management of the company. So you can have just this long string of them, and so it's the cousin of the CEO's neighbor, and the son in this case is of course definite. So if you have something to say about him that he's stupid, just say it has to be this stupid in that case. Okay. So I mentioned earlier this whole thing about definiteness and indefiniteness, and I kind of explain what's going on here. So pick two words. The first word, so word 1 appears before word 2. Word 1 is the word katib or writer, and word 2 is the word artist or fanan. And you can look at, basically you can find all 4 combinations of, in terms of the first one is definite, the second one is definite, the first one indefinite, the second one indefinite. So you get all the combinations of them. But then there is, deterministically, there's certain interpretations that come out of this because of the definiteness. Right, so in the first case of definite, you get the il-katib al-fanan, or the artistic writer. So it's the writer, the artist. And this actually is quite common. You see it like in news when they talk about certain artists or certain, so it's kind of like saying, oh, he's excellent, just kind of these very nice adjectives that they like to add. So he's not just a writer, he's an artistic writer, and they add a lot of them sometimes. Just it's very flowery, but it does appear. Or actually in referring to leaders, you can also use the same kind of, you see the same kind of flowery, multiple adjectives that come after that. That could also be ambiguous as nouns themselves. Now, in the second case here, you get, it's katib al-fanan, so this is writer, the artist, and in this case it has to be an idafa construction. It's the writer of the artist. There's no agreement that's showing here, so you have to do that. In the lower side over there, the you get a copular construction when the first one is definite and the second one is indefinite. And in this case, you get an indefinite agreement in the adjectives. Also, this could also be a variation on the idafa, but it's where like everything is indefinite, but it's a bit odd. So it's like a writer of an artist. But it's less common than the other reading. And in the Arabic tree bank, so you have all the idafa and all the information about the structure is indicated there. But if you're using the basic part of speech set or the simplified part of speech set, the B set, there is definiteness is not marked as part of. So you have only noun. You get the plural singular, but you don't get information about whether definiteness is there. Okay, so with the computational resources, I'm actually going to kind of fly through these because you'll have the slides. You can look at them if you have any questions. Okay, so with machine translation, so this is kind of very general. I'm not going to, there's no details of any, just kind of general issues that are interesting. And I know if you have any more questions about this, we can talk about this.
Let me ask you a question on something before. You don't have to change.
Okay.
The phrase structure that you were talking about.
Yes.
Did you now give us a more or less exhaustive list of things that happen, or is this?
Oh, no, not hardly. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so I didn't talk about preposition phrases. I mean, in some cases, like in the case of the PPs, they look similar to English, so I didn't talk about them. But there's a lot of other things. Yeah, but I talked about the most common ones, so nouns are quite common. And the most different too, yes. Yeah. So a big question when you're talking about the translation, which we've all dealt with so far, is this issue of tokenization and which level of tokenization you want to go to. So just to remind you what's going on. So we talked before about there's the natural token, which is as it appears in the data. The word, meaning we clean up some of, any fluff that appears around the data, like these elongation characters and others. You have the segmented words, and I talked about different variations of segmentations, and I'm just picking here the one that appears in the tree bank. You can talk about, deeper representations or kind of more explicit and shallow representations. So there's actually multiple dimensions in which these vary. And in terms of, what do you use? Well, it depends on what kind of approach you're interested in doing. So if you're interested in doing something that has to do more with symbolic MT, in principle, you need something that gives you a hook to some token that says something about the meaning, right? So it's some lemma or like seam entry, a dictionary entry that you can look up or have a lexicon that's structured around it. And for those, doing work at the level of the segmented word or the word is kind of, you can do it, but it's less appropriate. It makes the lexicon much more complicated. In terms of statistical MT, I think it's kind of more robust. You can take any of these higher levels. And of course, the more you go down, the more decisions you have to make about what kind of segmentations, what kind of decisions you're making, right? So if you do segment the word only, if you just pick the word, that's the easiest. You keep all the ambiguity that's in the word. But then you have high sparsity issues. If you do the segmented word, you're making some decisions. We can do them for the tree bank with really high degree of accuracy, like over 99%. So that's good. And then you still don't have to decide whether the word is actually a noun or a verb or what's going on with it. It doesn't really matter. But the more decisions you go down, you have to make more decisions. So that becomes more complicated. Now, this is kind of more like a resource page. I just wanted to say this. I've said before that there's this problem again. Different resources having different levels of representation. Just be aware of it, and when you're hooking things up, to know what is it that you're getting into. And so I wanted to just kind of, so this is translation diversion, is something that I was always interested in and I've worked on. And the reason I'm actually not going to talk more about variation in the structure between Arabic and English. I consider that covered in the discussion of the syntax. Basically, I allude to it at the top. Okay, so this is stuff beyond when the two sentences, have a certain number of words that could be mapped into each other, and it's just an issue of transforming the trees. So we know VSO, SVO variation, noun, adjective, adjective, noun variations. But then there's the other interesting cases where you have the way Arabic describes things is quite different than the way English does or some other language does, and those would have to be addressed in some way. And I think, especially for the guys who are working on the MT and parsing, this would be one of the places where it would be interesting because the parsers are not going to match with each other. So, the people who do phrase-based MT do quite well in covering these phenomena when they see them in the data, right? But the interaction is going to be an interesting interaction. So I'm going to be going through some examples of things where, and again, you can look at a lot of these and say, well, this is easy doing this or doing that. So I'm not kind of discussing solutions, but rather just, what are the interesting phenomena here where the structure looks quite different. Just again, each one of these just an example I picked off the top of my head for a class of that kind of behavior. So things where this example appeared earlier, where at me book becomes I have a book, right? And here the object of the preposition is really the subject of some verb that has been transformed. You get the laysa, which is the not be auxiliary that we had before. So this is another case of conflation where the be and not are merged together, and interacts interestingly with word order. So here the phrase structure, the structure will give you some hints to what's going on. The case of the idafa construction, where you have to insert this extra node, whether it's an av or an apostrophe s between the two nodes on the Arabic. So you have to recognize that you have that construction and then transform it. And then there's things that are kind of more general, like you have this problem whenever you're translating from one language to another, where the arguments of the verb are realized using, different ways. So you might have the object in one case become the object of a prepositional phrase that follows. In this case, I picked the verb to find. So in Arabic, you find upon a something, you don't find the thing. So that's something you'd have to learn what the relationship is going on there. Some cases of thematic and in inflation. So my head is hurting me, or versus my head hurts, or I have a headache. But this is for people who've looked at translation divergences. Usually, you get this. There's a classic example of I cross the river swimming and I swim across the river, where the verb and the preposition just move around. And in Arabic, this is quite realistic example actually, where it gets even more complex if you add the factor of speed, that I cross the river swimming in a fast way. When in standard Arabic, at least, the most common way to express the speed factor is to actually to say the verb I sped, so it's like I sped crossing the river, swimming manner. And here you can see, basically the verb that's the head of the structure in the Arabic becomes an adverbial. The object of the verb is the head, and now it's a verb, and then so you have lots of things moving around. Just kind of interesting cases. Okay. So again, actually, I don't need to talk about these resources. Everybody knows about them here, so just going to skip through these. And do you have any questions, actually, about anything so far? Because now we're switching to a kind of a different topic. Yeah?
Are you aware of any empirical studies of the distributions of these phenomena in running text?
Right. So there was work that was done by Dor. Was it? Well, Dor and me. Yes, Dor et al. Actually, it was a bunch of people, but it was done for Spanish. We have not done it for Arabic. It would be.
No, I mean specifically for Arabic.
Yeah.
Arabic as well.
We did it for a small set, though. It wasn't. The Spanish one was quite large coverage, whereas the Arabic one was just.
You were sort of finding in, what was it, 1/3 to 1/4 of the sentences, you would find some divergence in one of the categories
That we had, yeah.
put up on the screen.
Right. So we can forward you the paper on this.
One more question.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Dan.
I was going to say, I'm specifically interested in Arabic right now.
Right.
Right.
No, there is a discussion of the Arabic, but it's a smaller scale than the Spanish one.
And it was on that order, it was 1/4 to 1/3 of the sentences somewhere.
But both on the same paper?
I can't remember.
The languages are discussed in the same paper?
That's right.
Yeah. Okay.
Because the answer paper either 2 years ago or 3 years ago.
Okay, my question, I may have missed it in your first talk, but you had a slide here which had the orthographic word and then the canonical word and so on. Can you go back to that for a minute?
In here, you
No,
mean?
keep going back. Yeah, I think right there, yeah.
Ah, here we go.
Yeah, so in these, what steps are easy? You said that most lexicons have, in other words, if you gave me running text which had these natural tokens,
Right.
how, for each transformation, what is the process and how automatable or automatable?
Right. So all of these are, automatable. I mean, you can do it all automatically. The problem is the amount of ambiguity that you have to do, right, to disambiguate, to pick correctly. And that also is done automatically. So we definitely can go to this level. This was work that I did with Owen Rambo in ACL this year, to actually how to get to this level with about 96% accuracy here. Again, this is usually, this is the first step. So it's kind of like, you get the biggest hit that multiply everywhere else. And in some cases, I've seen from people who've asked me questions in the past about, working on tokenization. Sometimes you get really bad results because of mixing between representations. So you use, for example, I don't know, Buckwalter analyzer in some way, but then the tree bank, even though Buckwalter analyzer was used in the tree bank initially as a step, like to do the pre-processing, the tokens that they use are different, quite different from the tokens that are used in Buckwalter's lexicons or the output of Buckwalter. So you have to make certain decisions on how to use these two. So it's not just straightforward using it and plugging it. You have to do a bit of more work on it. And I have actually a paper just on doing that kind of step to do jumping from the first level to this level or this. Using the resources here. So I can forward that to you too. It's actually at the end of in the references section. It's there. Right. But the issue is the ambiguity, right? The issue is like how ambiguous things can be, and.
And my next question also related to this, but it'll have to wait till the end of the talk. Is if I replace MSA with dialect now, what parts of these can you do?
Yeah, I think. I would say they would be about the same, except that in terms of the resources that we have to do a certain step. So kind of there's nothing I think conceptually about being at this level or this level that will change between dialect and MSA, except that the resources that we have to actually do practically use it to get there, to produce the possible options and then disambiguate them correctly. That's where it might be easier to actually stick to something shallow than attempt to go deeper. But for the work that we're doing here, we're actually using this level for the parsing, and we're using this level with a lot of noise, to do the translation step and then map it back to this level. So we're just basically on here and here. Okay. All right. So we're talking about dialects. And you've seen some of these slides before, but if you have, again, more questions here, just, let me know. There we go. The colors look really different. So, so in the Arab world, you have one form of Arabic that's standard Arabic, and this is a standard that's used all over the Arab world. And in this is basically what children, when they go to school, they go and they are educated in this form of Arabic. There was a study that was done in Tunisia at one point about looking at like the variation in the lexicon for a 6-year-old. And this is in terms of what a 6-year-old knows, like table, mommy, daddy, milk, whatever. And there was about 60% of the words they had to relearn when they go to school. So the MSA word for these basic words are just 60% are not the same as what they know. And this is not even discussing, syntax, morphology, any of the other stuff.
But
so
when you say different, do you mean just in vocalization or?
Different degrees, but I think, as I remember in that paper, they actually meant, actually the consonants were quite different. It wasn't just a difference in the, so you get a lot of words that are just not the same word.
So not mutually intelligible.
Well, some people argue that, yes. Yeah, some people argue that. And it's, but again, people are taught this at a very early age, and you get to see a lot of it around you. I mean, a lot of all the newspapers, people always do also code switching between the two. So for people, they don't actually realize that it's another thing altogether. It just, the general understanding of people is, I mean, the view for the layman is that, well, this is a proper way of talking, and this is a less proper way of talking. So it has also some negative psychological factors involved in it. So in this example, and I'll show you the rest of the examples of how you'd say this sentence if you were looking in different dialects group. This is a sentence that says did not. So there's the particle that appears at the beginning is a negation particle, and it's not just a negation. It's a negation particle plus also it affects the tense. So it's negated past. But the verb that it takes is always the imperfective. The N, we said before, there's the perfective and the imperfective. The imperfective is kind of N-specified tense, whereas the perfective tend to be completed, done. So this is a case where the imperfective appears with a particle that actually limits the tense space of it to be past. So it was this, did not buy, then comes the subject, Nizar, then, I put tawilatan jadidatan indicating it's tanween, the N endings indicate that it's indefinite, and the A before the N indicates that it's accusative. And a lot of these features just basically disappear. So if you go to Egypt, the way you would say this is Nizar mashtarash tarabiza gedida, and this horrible pronunciation of Egyptian. Mona's not here, good. Here you get your subject appears first, the verb. Even though you can see part of the phonology of the verb is shared in this case. Shtara and ishtara, they look similar. But then here the verb appears in the perfective form, not the imperfective. And negation is done using a circumfix negation that doesn't exist at all in MSA. So the red will always mark just this negation phenomena because it's interesting. And then you see the word, tawila and tarabeza, just different lexical item. Jadida and gedida, you can see the j, g. This is the most common form of phonological change that happens with a lot of MSA words into Egyptian is the j, g variation. When it's written, jadid versus gidid is not indicated, right? So you actually, and people when they write the two exactly the same way anyway, because they're not marking nunation, they're not marking case, and there's no special character for g versus j. In Arabic orthography, so they use the same character. So that also kind of cuts some of the edge of the difference, right? People say, this is a class of possible pronunciations. So you go to the Levant, so here you'd have something like Nizar mashtarash tawlish dide, and you get different phonology going on, like the feminine endings look different. Their syllabic structure changes. So Egyptian, and it's kind of this issue of like what is closer, what's the distance, from MSA. Well, it depends on what metric you're using and what dimensions. Egyptian has the closest syllabic structure form. So you can see a lot of the, you have the CVC, they just map very much the same to between MSA and Egyptian, but then there's phonological variations. Whereas with when you go to other dialects other than the Egyptians, there's more changes that happen on the level of the syllabic structure. And then we picked in Morocco, and here this is kind of an example that really just shows the lexical variations. Moroccan tends to be hard for people from the eastern side of the Arab world to understand what's going on. They have additional modified paradigms for verb conjugation, so it gets really quite wild, trying to follow up. Okay, so what's a dialect? So dialect is really about power, or actually lack of power, more like it. So usually people talk about, well, what is the, how do you decide whether it's a language or a dialect? Well, it depends if it has an army, or I think the expression is a language is a dialect with an army, basically, that believes that this is the language that they will use, right? It just, and I, in the work, for example, that I'm doing, the way we think about dialect is that we consider all of them are dialects. So, there's just, there's no special status for MSA versus others, except the fact that we have more resources for it. So it's a richer dialect versus the poorer dialects. But there's nothing, about, reference that this is a starting point and these are variations on it. Especially, that whatever was at one point Arabic produced both the standard and the variants that exist right now. So you cannot really talk about a relationship now of dependence in history. And the religious, of course, is important because for majority of Arabs are Muslims, and the language of the Holy Quran is Arabic, and it's not standard Arabic. I mean, it's not modern standard Arabic. It's kind of more old standard Arabic, or classical Arabic. And Arabs actually don't make a distinction between the two when they refer to them. This modern standard concept is more of a Western concept when we're talking about Arabic linguistics, but people talk about al-Fusha, or Arabi al-Fusha, which is basically the eloquent Arabic, and they don't, for them, this is just the current living form of the eloquent Arabic, which is the same as the Arabic of the Quran.
But it's different.
It's quite different lexically. So in terms of the syntax, it's really not. But in terms of lexical choices, I mean, there were actually at one point in Damascus and in Cairo, the centers, the academies for Arabic language discussed like simplifying the grammar, actually getting rid of nunation, getting rid of case marking in what is standard. So even when you read the news, can you do it this way? But a lot of these kind of options just kind of fell apart. There's a certain music to the way the language flows when you have all these case markings indicated that it's just broken when you don't do that. So I don't know. It's like the relationship. It's quite complicated. There's a lot of aesthetics of what makes Arabic Arabic that if you get rid of them, it just looks like something else. I mean, anytime you try to put a razor to a language and just cut things out, you're really creating a monster, versus if you take a dialect, for example, and just use it as is, a dialect has already created it's own, persona, and it has its own fullness to it. So there's a lot of...
That's how we got from Shakespearean English to the present monsters.
Right. But it's natural evolution versus, constructed language, right? You're just working on it yourself. So within regional dialects, people talk about Egyptian versus Levantine versus Gulf, North African, but then, so I put these in terms of like, the first four are the four big groups, but then people sometimes talk about the 5 big groups, or 6 groups. So, and even within each one of these, there's different subgroups. For example, in Egypt, Upper Egyptian and Lower Egyptian would look quite different in certain ways. There's certain things where, like Alexandrian Egyptian is actually closer to North African than Cairo Egyptian is. So, and again, it depends what phenomena you're looking at. So this is just general. And they tend to this issue about politics and power comes back again. So when people talk about Egyptian, they talk about Cairene, where the center of the power of Egyptian is. And then socially, you also get a lot of variance. Again, this is within each dialect. So big variance between like city, peasants, and Bedouin dialect that appear within the same dialect group or even sub-dialect group. You'll see these variations. And in some cases, like for example, Cairene Egyptian and Levantine, like, Damascus or Jerusalem Arabic are actually closer in certain ways than the Levantine, city dialect to one of the peasant dialects, So there's a lot of dimensions involved there too. One of another important concept here is this concept of diglossia, which basically, hi.
The linguistic definition of dialect versus language is based on the criteria of mutual intelligibility.
That's right. Except.
So I have the advantage of having seen this presentation before.
Right. No.
So I know what you're not going to say.
Right. No. So
how would you break up, all the various forms of Arabic,
right,
according to a linguistic definition?
Right. So I mean, within that definition, it's actually quite hard to construct an experiment where you can do this, I believe, especially because of the code switching, the stuff that comes later, where it's really. So I've actually discussed this. I mean, I wasn't serious because I think there is certain things where you're actually doing things that are wrong morally to do, like an ethical experimentation, where you basically take people and then never teach them anything about standard Arabic. They have to speak only that variation, that dialect that they know. And there, if you take a peasant from Morocco who've never been an illiterate person, and somebody from Kuwait, on the other end of the world, and then, I mean, this is the example that I usually use with Arabs, because Arabs, when they talk about this, they have a lot of emotional attachment to the idea of one language versus multiple languages. And in that case, I mean, it's hard to find these right people to bring together and get them to talk with each other and see if they actually understand or not. Also, there's this issue of, do you go at the level of, you're gonna read them a story or tell them a story and then ask comprehension, in which case you're actually not using the written medium, which helps, sometimes. It might not help other times. So I think it would be an interesting experiment to do, but I think it's quite hard to do it because, mainly because of this next slide here about that in reality, these are not two different, totally separate languages that are spoken in only certain areas or times, but there's actually a lot of mixing that happens between the two variants.
So gut level, like on the previous slide where you had regional, just your own feelings from being a native speaker of at least one of them.
Right.
Those roughly, because it's easy for me to draw analogies to the case of Chinese.
Right.
Where it's unclear because you can't do those experiments too easily.
Right.
Whether there's 4 languages, Mandarin, Cantonese,
right.
and Fujian, versus some linguists would argue up to 7 or 9.
Right.
But the thing is, at least that gives us an idea of what the rough range is.
Right.
So what would you?
It's really, I would really not want to give a number. Part of the problem is also this issue of like, for example, for me, if I listen to Kyrene, I do have a certain amount of comprehension that comes because of similarity to Levantine, but also because I've been, for, first 17 years of my life, I've been watching Egyptian movies, and I get to see a lot of examples. So that actually biases my model of understanding of what's going on. But for me, for example, if I listen to something from Upper Egypt, closer to the Sudan, I would consider it quite different from Kyrene because I've never heard that. But then maybe for someone like Mona who speaks Kyrene natively, her understanding, her model of Egyptian makes things closer to the point that it's within the mutual intelligibility rather than, you know what I mean? So it's quite hard. I'm not giving you answers, yeah.
Okay, let me not ask you for your gut feel. What have linguists who study Arabic? What's the range?
It's really like I said. You get these 4-level groupings, and you get deeper. People would specify. So usually in papers on like Levantine morphology or whatever, people will say, "Well, I'm doing specifically Palestinian peasant morphology," and then they would tell you which area or like which region or even specifically which town they did their work on. But I've never seen anything that says here's a measure of distance that locates all of these. There are lots of studies that were done by linguists where they take a certain set of words, like most common words, and then trace them. So you see these maps of Egypt where you can like go through the book and see like how the words change when you're going from one place, along the Nile to the south. But it's very continuous. It's very hard to kind of draw lines and say, if you're on this side of it, you speak this way and I can't understand you.
Yeah,
It's
there's a practical reason for my questions, which is beyond just philosophical interest.
right.
Sort of knowing roughly how many systems to build. So again, by
Right.
Chinese,
Right.
like, we're pretty sure that we want separate systems for Mandarin versus Cantonese.
Right. And I have to admit that I might actually be, my sense of not thinking about the problem this way is because from my impressions and my gut feeling, to go back to that, about how complex the situation is, I'd rather think about solutions that actually will be multi-dialectal rather than a single dialect. This might not work in this case, but there's the issue of how many systems to build. That mean how many tree banks do you want to have, and how many, and that becomes quite complicated. It might not be. There's a lot of similarities between these variants that we should try to exploit. At least that's my research position. Right.
Each of those major 4 to 9 languages has hundreds of dialects.
Okay.
Right, and they're sometimes quite hard to understand. If you struggle, native speakers struggle, and you sort of make it out. So it's really, really analogous.
Right.
But the thing is that there are these clusters which, again, like you say, it's very hard to define exactly where the borders are.
Right.
But they're sort of clustered and you can identify that, and it kind of makes sense to do adaptation on your
Right.
syntax model and your phonetic phonological model within those clusters.
Right, right.
And if you try to stretch it beyond that, your
Right.
model's going to start not performing so well. So like basically it's sort of asking, okay, how many sentences?
So I mean, all right, I'll give you a number. So I. Yeah, 42. No, I would go with Egypt and Sudan as two separate entities rather one. So the basic you start with the 4 or 5. I would probably push it up to 8 or 9, but I wouldn't go more than that. Okay, all right. But each one of these will have basically a copy of this kind of relationship where you have, so this was done by a linguist called Badawi in Egypt, who looked at the variations within Cairene, just Cairene, and looking at, so what this weird graph means is that there's these 3 influences that are going on that help explain the different levels. So one influence is the dialect influence or the colloquial influence. One is the standard influence or the Fusha, the eloquent Arabic influence. And then the third one, and don't ask why he puts it on both sides, it's just supposed to be a pretty graph, I think that's it, is a foreign. So this is the amount of foreign borrowings that happen into the language. And based on this, you still get a continuum of relationships here, right? So the idea is that the most colloquial, if you go to like the illiterate, areas of Cairo where Arabic is spoken, it tends to have a lot of the colloquial, of course. Sometimes you'll have some borrowings from MSA that might come from, quoting things from holy books or expressions that have just moved into the dialect because of, like they hear it on the news a lot. And you also get a little bit of the foreign, so they would have less English or French borrowings. Whereas people that are, more educated, who are like in the nicer areas of Cairo, will have a mix of all of these together, in more than what you get in the less illiterate. Now, if you're somebody is trying to speak, to do a presentation, let's say in Al-Azhar, which is like, this is like the biggest university in Cairo, about like 500, 600 years old. No, actually more, I think, sorry. I think it's around 1,000 years old, but I could be wrong. But it's a big religious center, and there, you would not be expected to use any colloquials of foreign borrowings. You want to be at this higher level, try to sound very formal. But it's more formal than the formal you would have if you were doing a presentation, let's say, in American university in Arabic on your, I don't know, electrical engineering project. If you're, so you would not use colloquial. You would use something that's kind of more modern. But you can slip easily into colloquialism. You're probably very likely to be using foreign words, because in that case it's jargon. So again, there's all these other pieces of what domain you're in. What hat are you wearing when you're talking? Okay. So give more examples of variations, and this is slide, the top of it you've seen earlier before, where I was trying to illustrate the relationship between written Arabic and the phonology of standard Arabic. And the point earlier was that there's a lot of one-to-one mapping, and we discussed all these funny cases where things are mixing. When you go to Levantine, and although there is no actual standard, there is no Academy of Levantine Arabic that says here's how you spell things. So this creates a lot of problems. So you get a lot of variations, and sometimes in the cases where I've seen text that was written, like recording, folk tales or recording poems or whatever, you will see the same author actually change orthography sometimes in the same page. They would write a word one way, and then they decide that it's going to. They write it differently, and it's not clear. Sometimes it's kind of clear what they're trying to do. They're trying to kind of push you toward more how to pronounce it versus how to understand it. But in some cases, it's not really clear whether it's just like there's just a random distribution and they just pick one versus the other at different times. I know, for example, I looked through a novel that was actually in Egyptian in this case. It was totally written in Egyptian Arabic. And, so the future particle was written in 3 different ways at least that I saw. And sometimes it's attached, sometimes it's separated. It's written as a ha versus a h, which a lot of people cannot hear the difference with, and clearly the author didn't. So sometimes it's spelled this way, sometimes spelled the other. It's not really, and this is a big problem. But for the project we're working on dialect parsing, LDC basically picked an orthography. They just made decisions for how to write things. And in the cases where they couldn't decide, I know Tim Buckwalter did searches on the web to see, like, in the cases that people have written in the dialect, did they pick to write this way or that way? Of course, even that, you're not guaranteed to get, you're going to find the things that you're looking for. You might not find things that also were intended to be what you're looking for, but you know.
So would that novel be distributed outside of Egypt then? And if it were, would it be intelligible for people reading it?
Right. So I think in the case of Egyptian, because of the media, it would be easier. I know that I have not heard about that author before. I've only heard about her in the stuff that she did for like movies and television series. But I didn't know that she wrote a novel in Egyptian. That sounded a bit too much, even to the point that she had to write an introduction kind of apologizing for writing it in Egyptian and kind of saying that the reason she had to do it this way is because she did not want any, blocks between her feelings coming onto the paper. It was more of a autobiography too. So she spilled a lot of dirty laundry about people and stuff. And it just it was nice. I mean, when you're reading it, it's as if you're sitting with someone and they're telling you a story. Which I actually liked that, but it's quite different. To actually sit down and try to rewrite it again would just make it kind of more stifled, I'd say. Yeah.
So normally all novels are in classical?
It's standard Arabic. Yeah, standard Arabic. Okay, so in the Levantine case, I just show some examples here where you get additional vowels. So you have, for example, Levantine has 5 vowels instead of 3 in standard Arabic, so you get 5 long and 5 short instead of 3 long and 3 short. You get some new phonemes that didn't exist, and then some reassignment, or I'm kind of making it ambiguous when you go to the writing. So this here is a th grapheme that maps to one thing in standard Arabic, but then in Levantine it could be either th if you're trying to pronounce the standard, or it could be t, or it could be s. So you have like 3 different split that in some cases the word has changed over time, so it became t. In some cases you're borrowing it, but you are not able to produce it correctly, so the s pronunciation is acceptable. And if you're trying to show off and show your pronunciation ability, you pronounce it as t. So you get a word like revolution is, thawra or sawra, both are acceptable. Okay, and more examples of variations between dialects lexically. So you saw the table example earlier. There's more examples here of things. What's interesting here is that I marked in red all the cases that if you write it in some basic, without making any major decisions on the orthography, all these forms would look exactly the same. So this has an effect of basically, for example, in the Egyptian, otta and qitta, they would just, a common decision is to write the glottal stop when it comes historically from the qaf in qaf, so you don't actually, spell it in a glottal stop. See. So morphological variations, I've mentioned these earlier. So with nouns, there's no case markings anymore, which means there's a kind of intentionally a more strict word order. But as you know from MSA, there is MSA in its current form, the way it's written, doesn't really vary a lot in word order anyway. And there might actually be a relationship between the fact that the dialects have lost it and that people just don't try fancy orderings that are allowed but are going to be harder for people to understand. Some of the paradigm reductions, like masculine and feminine plurals in some cases are merged for the verbs, actually also in some cases for the nouns. So you have lots of dual forms, although they stay in the noun, but then they're disappeared from the verb paradigm. Mood is not really the same anymore. So there's a lot of things that become more simplified, but there's some things that also become more complicated. And so one of them is this issue of verb morphology. where, we saw before that, in MSA you could have your conjunction, tense marker, verb, subject, and object appearing as a single unit. And in the dialect, you can add to that the indirect object. So you could actually have 3 pronominal references within the single word and negate everything together in one single word. So this is in Egyptian, ma katabtu halush, which is, and you did not write it for him. So the you, it, and him are all basically within the morphology of the single word. And this is kind of interesting because there's kind of this sense sometimes when you talk about language change that, that language would tend to become more simplified over time. Something just gets simpler because we think, why would people want to make their lives harder? Except then, we see that in Arabic and its dialect in some cases, but there's these examples where things are becoming much more complex in certain ways. This is, here you get different kind of ambiguities that you might not have in standard. I'm not going to actually spend too much time on this slide. The expression of tense is also kind of interesting. So you still have the perfect versus imperfect split, and they are consistent. But then what is the present tense in MSA is now unmarked, like 0 tense in Levantine. And then other things, to actually mark the present tense, you have to do other things and add. So you have to add a B prefix to specify it. The future marker just looks totally different independently. So in terms of the syntax variations, remember in MSA we said there's these 2 orders that we can see for VSO and SVO. And in the dialects, we have both also appear. However, in terms of their morphological agreement, they behave exactly the same way. Which in this case, so the verb agrees fully with the subject, regardless of the order that it appears in, which has indications for like, well, when you create these trees, do you want to create them with, a different context-free, phrase structure, that explains it, or you want to stick to something that's closer to MSA? I know in the LDC when they did the current set that we're working on, they stuck to something similar to the MSA. Because you could still also get the MSA phrase, structure appearing as MSA internally there too. Idafa is the same, exactly, except that you also can have the other variant where you have the explicit marker of structure that says one, noun 1 of noun 2. So, both are basically available. And the particle that's used varies a lot between dialects. So it's kind of makes things interesting. Also, in some cases, you get this issue of demonstratives appearing before or after. So, Standard Arabic says this man, whereas Egyptian does the man this. Okay, code switching, and this is just kind of an example. We've talked about this before. This issue of basically mixing between standard and a dialect. And in this example, you took this from a transcript from Al Jazeera in a talk show where it was a Lebanese politician, and I marked in red all the times when he was speaking clearly in a dialect, and in black the cases when he was speaking in standard Arabic. And of course, if this was done by listening to the transcript. So actually, I knew exactly what he said. In some cases, when they wrote the transcripts, they cleaned up some things, or they just wrote things in a way that make them look like standard Arabic. So again, this is always this issue. You might get a different bracketing if you're just asking someone to look at this and also like be biased. This is the default standard and then they're switching to the dialect, or is the default dialect and then switching to standard? So this is an interesting area of research, trying to figure out what the boundaries are.
So with closed captioning, is that a common thing for television, and does that mean that it's
Right.
less useful than it might be?
Right. So I've never seen closed captioning in Arabic. I haven't watched Arabic TV in quite a while, like just on a daily basis. So I'm not really sure that they have it, but it would be interesting to see what happens. But when they, in sometimes you see in movies, of course, subtitles are common. And I've seen subtitles on dialect movies. Like if it was a Moroccan movie, they would put Arabic subtitles in standard Arabic to help people on the eastern side to like really get what's going on, because sometimes it's harder. And there it's translated, so that's really not answering your question.
Brian, as far as I know, we don't have Arabic TV with closed caption.
Yeah.
Go to the broadcast news, you guys did a lot of this bootstrapping, right? And they don't do it in the animated programs. Part of the reason is no time.
What about cartoons? Are they dubbed in the various dialects?
Right. So.
That's a good criterion.
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting because cartoons when I grew up were always done in MSA. They were not dubbed into a dialect. However, recently I've seen cartoons that are dubbed into, so you have two versions of, I don't know, like pick a Disney movie, like Aladdin, or where they would have an Egyptian version and a Lebanese or Levantine version, and it's done by two different groups. And part of the problem there, just to make it closer, I guess, to what children hear, and there's certain kind of jokes and puns which Disney is filled, that you can, it really is very hard to get. I mean, the Egyptians might like it, but then other people might not get it. It's just very hard to do. So I've seen in some cases multiple versions of these being made. Yeah. See, I think this is like the last slide here, and it's just again computational resources, which we won't have to go to because I'm kind of over time, and the rest is just resources and references. So it's. If you have any more questions, we can talk also after this. All right, thank you.